Who was Jesus of Nazareth, really? And why do three of the world's largest religions look at the same man and see something completely different? Not a small question, not a simple one. This is the question that split empires, launched crusades, built cathedrals, inspired the Quran, and caused entire civilizations to define themselves by how they answered it. And today, 2,000 years later, the debate is still very much alive. Let's go back to the beginning. Around the 1st century, in a Roman-occupied territory called Judea, something happened that nobody fully predicted. A Jewish preacher from a backwater town called Nazareth began drawing crowds. He healed people, or so the accounts say. He spoke in parables. He challenged the religious establishment. He ate with social outcasts. And then, in a story that rewrote the arc of human history, he was executed by the Roman state. That should have been the end of it. Most movements die with their leaders. History is full of messianic figures who were crushed by Rome and forgotten within a generation. But something different happened here. Within decades of his death, communities were forming across the Mediterranean world in his name. Within 3 centuries, the Roman Empire itself had adopted his movement as its official religion. So who was this man? The honest answer is that it depends on who you ask, and not just theologically. Even at the purely historical level, scholars have been wrestling with the real Jesus for over 200 years, and they still disagree on the details. But let's map out what we do know, what each major tradition claims, and where those claims collide. Because the collision is the story. Start with the historical baseline. Most mainstream historians, religious and secular alike, agree on a basic outline. There was a man named Yeshua, which is the Aramaic version of Joshua. He lived in 1st century Judea. He was baptized by a figure known as John the Baptist. He gathered disciples. He was crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, somewhere around the year 30 or 33 CE. That much has enough corroboration from multiple independent sources, including the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus, that most scholars treat it as historical fact. Everything else is where the roads diverge. The primary sources for Jesus' life are the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are not biographies in the modern sense. They were written decades after the events they describe, likely between 65 and 100 CE, and each one has a particular theological agenda. Mark is the earliest and the most stark. Matthew and Luke expand on Mark and add material that scholars think came from a second source, which they call Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. John is the most theologically developed and reads almost nothing like the other 3. None of the Gospel authors were writing journalism. They were writing testimony, faith documents. This does not mean they are worthless historically, but it does mean you cannot read them the way you would read a news report. So when we ask who Jesus was, we are really asking 3 separate questions. Who was he historically? Who is he in Christian theology? And who is he in the theologies of the other traditions that engage with him? Let's start with Christianity. The Christian claim is the most radical, and it's important to understand just how radical it actually is. Christianity does not simply say that Jesus was a great moral teacher. It does not merely say he was a prophet sent by God. The core claim of Orthodox Christianity, hammered out in the early church councils of the 3rd and 4th centuries, is that Jesus of Nazareth was simultaneously fully human and fully divine. The second person of the Trinity, God incarnate. Not a symbol, not a metaphor. An actual physical intersection between the infinite and the finite. That is a wild claim. Let's be clear about that. Even within the early Christian movement, this claim was contested. Some early Christian groups believed Jesus was divine but only appeared to be human, that his physical body was a kind of projection. Others believed he was a purely human figure who was adopted by God at his baptism. Still others held positions so complex that the early councils spent centuries fighting about them. The Nicene Creed, formulated in 325 CE at the Council of Nicaea under the Roman Emperor Constantine, was the Church's official answer to these debates. It declared Jesus to be, quote, of one substance with the Father, meaning not similar to God, not a junior version of God, but actually, ontologically God himself in human form. Think about what this means. If Christianity is right about this claim, it is the single most significant event in the history of the cosmos. If it is wrong, it is one of the most audacious religious assertions ever made by any civilization. There is no neutral ground here. The Gospels themselves present Jesus as someone who was aware of his divine identity, though the degree of explicitness varies. In John's Gospel, Jesus says things like, "Before Abraham was, I am," a direct reference to the divine name revealed to Moses in Exodus. In the Synoptic Gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is somewhat more guarded, often referring to himself using the cryptic phrase, Son of Man, which has deep roots in Jewish apocalyptic literature. He forgives sins. Only God can forgive sins. In Jewish theology, he calms storms. He raises the dead. He claims authority over the Sabbath. Each of these acts, in their first-century Jewish context, carries an implicit divine claim that his audiences would have understood immediately. And then, there is the resurrection. For Christians, the resurrection is not simply a miracle story. It is the foundation of everything. The Apostle Paul, who wrote before the Gospels were composed, and whose letters are actually the earliest New Testament texts, says this explicitly. In his first letter to the Corinthians, he writes that, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless." The resurrection is not optional furniture in the house of Christian theology. It is the foundation itself. Whether the resurrection happened historically is, of course, a question that history cannot definitively answer. Historians can deal with the fact that early Christians believed it happened, that multiple early sources report it, and that the disciples were willing to die for this belief. What they cannot do is step inside the miracle and verify it. That step requires faith, and faith, by definition, is beyond historical method. Now, let's flip the frame completely. Islam has a profound respect for Jesus. This surprises a lot of people. Jesus is mentioned by name in the Quran more times than Muhammad is. He is called Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary. He is given titles of deep honor. In Islamic theology, he is a prophet, a messenger of God, and the Messiah. He performed miracles including healing the blind and raising the dead. He was born of a virgin. The Quran affirms the virgin birth explicitly in the chapter called Maryam, which is named after his mother. Islam's account of Jesus overlaps with Christianity in surprising ways, and then diverges on two absolutely critical points. First, Islam rejects the incarnation. The idea that God became a human being is, in Islamic theology, a category error of the most serious kind. The absolute unity and transcendence of God, called Tawheed in Arabic, is the central pillar of Islamic theology. God does not have children. God does not take on physical form. God is not limited, divided, or contained by anything in creation. To say that Jesus is God, or the Son of God in a literal ontological sense, is, from the Islamic perspective, the greatest of all sins, called shirk, meaning associating partners with God. The Quran repeatedly addresses this. It says Jesus was a servant and messenger of God, honored above other human beings, but a human being nonetheless. It calls those who say God is Jesus, son of Mary, guilty of unbelief, and those who say God is one of three, guilty of disbelief. The Trinity, as Christian theology articulates it, is from the Islamic viewpoint a misunderstanding introduced by later followers, a corruption of the pure monotheistic message that Jesus himself preached. Second, Islam rejects the crucifixion. This is perhaps the most dramatic theological divergence of all. The Quran, in chapter 4, verse 157, states that the Jews did not kill Jesus and did not crucify him, but it was made to appear so. Different Islamic scholars have interpreted this verse in different ways over the centuries. Some say God lifted Jesus directly to heaven before the crucifixion, and someone else was made to look like him and crucified in his place. Others interpret the verse differently, but the mainstream Islamic position across 14 centuries has been that Jesus was not crucified and did not die on the cross. Think about the weight of that divergence. For Christianity, the cross is everything. It is the logo of the faith. It is the mechanism of salvation. It is the central event of human history. Remove the crucifixion and resurrection from Christianity, and there is no Christianity. It dissolves. Islam says it did not happen. Two traditions, both rooted in the same Abrahamic soil, reading some of the same stories about the same figure, arriving at diametrically opposite conclusions about the most pivotal moment in his life. And then there is Islam's final word on Jesus. He will return in Islamic eschatology. At the end of times, Jesus, Isa, will descend from heaven. He will defeat the false Messiah, known as the Dajjal. He will break the cross, abolish the jizya tax, and there will be no religion accepted except Islam. In this vision, the second coming of Jesus is not a vindication of Christianity. It is, from the Islamic perspective, a fulfillment of the truth that Jesus himself originally taught. Now let's turn to Judaism. The Jewish position on Jesus is, in many ways, the most historically interesting of the three, because Jesus himself was Jewish. He was not a Christian. He was not a Muslim. He was a first-century Jew, shaped by the Torah, the synagogue, the Passover, and the turbulent political landscape of Roman-occupied Judea. Most mainstream Jewish theology does not consider Jesus to be the Messiah. This is not simply a theological disagreement. It is rooted in a specific understanding of what the Messiah was supposed to be and do. In Jewish expectation, particularly in the Second Temple period in which Jesus lived, the Messiah was expected to be a human king, a descendant of David, who would accomplish certain concrete, observable, historical tasks. He would drive out foreign oppressors. He would gather the Jewish people back to Israel. He would rebuild the temple. He would usher in an era of universal peace in which the nations of the world would recognize the God of Israel. Jesus did none of these things. He was executed by the Romans. The temple was not rebuilt but destroyed, 40 years after his death. The Jewish people were not gathered but scattered in what became one of the most catastrophic dispersions in human history. From the mainstream Jewish perspective, this is not a minor objection. The Messiah was supposed to fix the world, in Hebrew tikkun olam, a repairing of the world. The world was not fixed. It got arguably worse in the immediate aftermath. No amount of reinterpretation, no doctrine of a spiritual salvation or a second coming satisfies the requirements that the Jewish prophetic tradition laid out. The Messiah was supposed to do specific, observable, historical things. And a Messiah who fails to accomplish his mission and then requires a second trip to finish the job is not, by Jewish theological standards, the Messiah at all. This is not hostility to Jesus, the man. Many Jewish scholars have appreciated Jesus as a Jewish teacher, a charismatic healer, a prophet in the prophetic tradition. The scholar Geza Vermes, himself Jewish, wrote extensively and with genuine admiration about the historical Jesus as a Galilean holy man in the tradition of earlier figures like Elijah. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach has written about Jesus as a Jewish revolutionary whose message was later co-opted and transformed by Paul of Tarsus into something Jesus himself would not have recognized. But the divine claims, the messianic identity, the replacement of Torah observance with faith in Jesus as the pathway to God, these are rejected. And here the relationship between Christianity and Judaism gets complicated in ways that have real historical weight. For most of Western history, the theological rejection of Jesus by Jewish communities was used as a justification for anti-Semitism. The charge of being Christ killers was applied to Jewish people for centuries, leading to pogroms, expulsions, and eventually contributing to the ideological climate that made the Holocaust possible. This is part of the story of Jesus that does not get told enough. The figure who, in Christian theology, is the Prince of Peace, became, in the hands of certain historical actors, a justification for violence against his own people. the Vatican formally repudiated the charge of collective Jewish guilt for the death of Jesus in the Second Vatican Council document Nostra Aetate in 1965. But that repudiation came after nearly 2 millennia of the opposite. So, we have 3 traditions. One says Jesus is God. One says he is a prophet. One says he is, at most, a failed messianic claimant or a Jewish teacher of limited historical significance. Is it possible to step outside all 3 frames and ask what scholarship itself says? This is the project that became known as the quest for the historical Jesus, and it is one of the most fascinating intellectual adventures in modern academic history. It began in the 18th century with a German scholar named Hermann Samuel Reimarus, who proposed that Jesus was a failed Jewish revolutionary whose disciples invented the resurrection story after his death to save face. A bit like a political campaign that keeps spinning even after the candidate loses, except the stakes were infinitely higher. Then came David Friedrich Strauss in the 19th century, who applied the concept of myth to the Gospels and scandalized the Christian world. Then Albert Schweitzer. Yes, the same Albert Schweitzer who became famous for his hospital in Africa, who argued in his 1906 masterwork that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who believed the end of the world was imminent, acted accordingly, and was mistaken. Schweitzer's Jesus is strange and uncomfortable. He is not a gentle moral philosopher. He is a fiery Jewish prophet who expected cosmic transformation within his own lifetime. He threw himself against the wheel of history, Schweitzer wrote, and the wheel turned and crushed him. That image has haunted New Testament scholarship ever since. The 20th century brought what scholars call the third quest for the historical Jesus, which emphasized placing Jesus firmly within his Jewish context. Scholars like E. P. Sanders, N. T. Wright, John P. Meyer, and Bart Ehrman have all contributed major works that, while differing dramatically in their conclusions, share the conviction that you cannot understand Jesus apart from first-century Judaism. John P. Meyer, a Catholic priest and scholar, spent 4 massive volumes constructing what he called a marginal Jew, a Jesus who was historically recoverable, genuinely Jewish, and theologically provocative. His method was to ask what a group of scholars from different religious backgrounds stuck in a library basement could agree on about Jesus without their theological commitments. The result is fascinating and, depending on your background, either comforting or unsettling. Bart Ehrman, who began as an evangelical Christian and lost his faith while studying the New Testament in graduate school, has become the most widely read popular scholar of early Christianity. He emphasizes the diversity of early Christian thought, the human origins of the New Testament texts, and the ways in which the historical Jesus and the theological Christ have been layered on top of each other over centuries. His books sell millions of copies and generate enormous controversy in religious circles. N. T. Wright goes the opposite direction. A former bishop of Durham and now a professor at St. Andrews, Wright argues that the resurrection is not only theologically essential, but historically defensible. He contends that the empty tomb and the post-resurrection appearances are better explained by an actual bodily resurrection than by any alternative hypothesis scholars have proposed. He is, by any measure, a serious intellectual, and his argument deserves to be taken seriously even by those who ultimately disagree. The point is that this conversation is ongoing. It is alive. It is not settled. And anyone who tells you it is fully settled, on either the believing or the skeptical side, is oversimplifying. Let's zoom out again and look at the bigger picture. Why does it matter so much how you answer the question of who Jesus was? Because the answer determines your entire framework for understanding salvation, ethics, human nature, and the destiny of the cosmos. In Christianity, Jesus is the means of reconciliation between a holy God and a broken humanity. The theology of atonement, the idea that his death accomplished something on behalf of human beings, has been articulated in several different ways across Christian history. The substitution theory says he took the punishment that humanity deserved. The moral influence theory says his life and death primarily serve as a transformative example. The Christus Victor theory says his resurrection was a cosmic defeat of death and evil as powers. These are not minor variations. They imply very different understandings of what is wrong with humanity and how it gets fixed. In Islam, there is no original sin in the Christian sense. Human beings are not born in a fallen condition, requiring a divine rescue. They are born in a state of natural submission to God, called fitra, and they go astray through their own choices. Salvation, in Islamic theology, does not require a divine sacrifice. It requires repentance, submission to God, and righteous living. Jesus' role in this framework is to model prophetic obedience, not to die for anyone's sins. In Judaism, the entire framework of individual soul salvation through a specific religious event is foreign to the tradition's core concerns. Jewish theology is much more focused on communal covenant, on the relationship between God and the people of Israel, on Torah observance as the pathway to right relationship with God, and on the collective hope for a transformed world. The question of what happens to individual souls after death is less centrally developed in classical Jewish thought than Christians often assume. 3 different anthropologies, 3 different understandings of what is broken, 3 different visions of what redemption looks like. And at the center of all 3, in one way or another, stands this first-century Jewish man from Nazareth. Here is something worth sitting with. Jesus himself left no writings. Not a single word in his own hand has survived, if he ever wrote anything at all. Everything we know about him comes through the accounts of others, and those accounts were written in Greek, while Jesus almost certainly spoke Aramaic. We are already at a translation, and that translation was made by communities with their own needs, conflicts, and theological convictions. This is not unique to Jesus. We have the same problem with Socrates, who also left no writings, and who we know primarily through his student Plato. We have it with Buddha, whose teachings were also transmitted orally for centuries before being written down. The further you go back into history, the more you are dealing with memory, tradition, and interpretation, rather than raw documentation. But the stakes with Jesus are uniquely high because the claims made about him are uniquely high. If the claims about Socrates are slightly exaggerated, philosophy loses some nuance. If the claims about Jesus are wrong, according to the traditions themselves, the implications range from catastrophic to liberating, depending on which direction you are wrong in. Let's talk about Paul for a moment. The Apostle Paul is arguably the most important figure in the history of Christianity after Jesus himself, and possibly before him in terms of theological shaping. Paul never met the living Jesus. He was, by his own account, a Pharisee who actively persecuted the early Christian movement. And then, on a road to Damascus, something happened to him that he described as an encounter with the risen Christ. That experience transformed him into the most prolific and theologically creative writer in the New Testament. His letters, written in the 50s CE, predate all 4 Gospels and represent our earliest written Christian sources. And in those letters, Paul develops a theological framework that goes well beyond anything explicitly stated in the Synoptic Gospels. His theology of justification by faith, his understanding of the Church as the body of Christ, his cosmic vision of Jesus as the Lord of creation, all of this shaped what Christianity became far more than most churchgoers realize. Some scholars, including Jewish thinkers like Chaim Maccobi, have argued that Paul essentially invented Christianity as a distinct religion, separating it from Judaism and building something new on the foundation of the Jesus story. Others, like N.T. Wright and James Dunn, argue that Paul was a faithful interpreter of the Jewish apocalyptic tradition and of Jesus' own self-understanding. Either way, Paul's influence is undeniable. The Christianity that conquered Rome, that became the Western world's default spiritual framework, that shaped hospitals and universities and legal codes and music and art, is substantially Pauline Christianity. And Paul is precisely the figure that Islam and Judaism view with the most theological suspicion. Now, let's talk about something that often gets left out of these conversations: the sheer diversity within each tradition. When we say Christianity, we are simultaneously talking about a medieval mystic in a French monastery, a Pentecostal preacher in Lagos, a Coptic Christian in Cairo, whose tradition predates the Roman Catholic Church, an Eastern Orthodox theologian in Athens, and a liberal Protestant pastor in Seattle who is not sure about the physical resurrection. These are all, in some sense, Christians. But their understanding of Jesus would in some cases be barely recognizable to each other. When we say Islam, we are talking about Sunni and Shia traditions with their own internal schools of jurisprudence, Sufi mystics who speak of Jesus in terms of spiritual proximity and divine love, and reformist movements that emphasize the purely prophetic role. The Jesus of Sufi poetry, particularly in the work of Rumi, has a warmth and spiritual intimacy that surprises people who associate Islam only with its most austere expressions. When we say Judaism, we are talking about orthodox, conservative, reform, and reconstructionist movements, along with a diverse range of Hasidic traditions, each with their own relationship to the classical rabbinic dismissals of Christian claims about Jesus. And beyond these three traditions entirely, there is the Jesus of Gnosticism, the early Christian movements that were declared heretical and suppressed, whose texts were largely lost until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945. The Gnostic Jesus is a divine revealer, a cosmic figure who brings secret knowledge, gnosis, about the true nature of reality. He is less interested in dying for sins than in waking people up from the illusion of the material world. Then, there is the Jesus of Thomas Jefferson, who famously cut up a Bible with scissors, removed every miraculous element, and published what he called the Jefferson Bible, which preserved the moral teachings of Jesus while eliminating the supernatural claims entirely. There is the Black liberation theology, Jesus of James Cone, who identified Christ specifically with the suffering of Black Americans and argued that the cross was a symbol of solidarity with the oppressed rather than a transaction to satisfy divine wrath. There is the feminist theology Jesus of scholars like Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who argued that Jesus' movement was radically egalitarian and that the patriarchal structures of the later church betrayed his original vision. Every generation, every culture, every social location seems to produce its own version of Jesus. And this is either deeply suspicious, suggesting that people simply project onto him what they want to see, or deeply revealing, suggesting that the figure is genuinely capacious enough to speak across every human context. Maybe both. Here is the uncomfortable question that all of this raises. Is it possible to know who Jesus really was, underneath all of these interpretations? The honest answer from scholarship is partially. We can recover a general outline. We can say with reasonable confidence what kind of Jew he was, what movement he was part of, what his message centered on, how he died, and why his followers believed he had risen. Beyond that, the details become disputed, the sources become theologically loaded, and the certainty becomes intellectually dishonest. But here is what is striking. Even in the most skeptical, historically minimalist reconstruction of Jesus, what you get is still an extraordinary human being. A man whose message about the kingdom of God, about the radical reversal of social hierarchies, about love of enemies, about forgiveness as a form of power, about the worth of every individual human being regardless of their social status. That message echoed across centuries and continents and became, in various forms, the moral baseline of entire civilizations. The words attributed to him in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers." These words have been quoted at peace negotiations, inscribed on monuments, read at funerals, and carried by soldiers and by pacifists alike. They have been used to justify nearly every position on every major moral question, which is either a sign of their depth or their ambiguity, or possibly both. Even if you strip away every supernatural claim, you are left with a figure whose impact on human history is without parallel. And that, in itself, is one of the most compelling mysteries in the entire human story. Because small things do not generate that kind of impact. Whatever Jesus was, he was not small. There is one more dimension of this story worth exploring, and it is often overlooked. All three of these traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, are themselves not static. They are living, evolving conversations across time. The Christianity of the early church is not identical to medieval Christianity, which is not identical to the Christianity of the Protestant Reformation, which is not identical to contemporary global Christianity. The Islam of 7th century Arabia is not identical to classical Abbasid civilization, which is not identical to today's globally diverse Muslim communities. Judaism in the Second Temple period is barely recognizable as the rabbinic Judaism that emerged after the destruction of the Temple in 70 CE, which is itself different from modern Orthodox or Reform Judaism. Each of these traditions has been continuously reinterpreting itself, arguing within itself, reforming and counter-reforming. The question of who Jesus was is not asked in a vacuum. It is asked by people embedded in living communities with centuries of tradition, trauma, political history, and spiritual experience behind them. This means that the question is never purely intellectual. It is always also personal. Answering it, truly answering it, means engaging not just with texts and historical evidence, but with community, with tradition, with the question of what kind of life you want to live and what kind of world you believe we are living in. The philosophical theologian Paul Tillich once described Jesus as the symbol of ultimate concern. Regardless of what you believe about the literal historical claims, Tillich argued, this figure has functioned for 2,000 years as the place where humanity's deepest questions about meaning, justice, love, and death get asked most intensely. Whether or not he is God, he has functioned as the mirror in which Western civilization, and increasingly global civilization, sees its own deepest longings reflected back. That is a staggering observation, and it holds up. Look at almost any major debate about human dignity, about suffering, about redemption, about justice, and you will find Jesus somewhere in the background, being invoked, contested, reinterpreted, claimed, or rejected. Abolitionists cited him to end slavery. Slaveholders cited him to justify it. Pacifists cite him to oppose war. Just war theorists cite him to justify military defense of the innocent. Liberation movements cite him. Conservative establishments cite him. He is everywhere in the argument, and the argument never stops. So who was Jesus really? He was a first-century Jewish man whose life ended on a Roman cross and whose story refused to end there. He was, for Christians, the Son of God, the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world, the risen Lord at whose name every knee will bow. He was, for Muslims, the miraculous, virgin-born prophet, the Word of God cast into Mary, the one who will return at the end of days to restore justice, and the one who was not crucified as the story appeared to say. He was, for Jews, a fellow Jew, perhaps a great teacher, perhaps a tragic, failed messianic claimant, whose movement was subsequently transformed into something that became, too often, a source of danger for his own people. He was, for secular historians, a complex, compelling, historically significant figure whose impact far exceeded what any first-century observer could have predicted. And he was, for the billions of people across 2 millennia who have prayed in his name, wept at his cross, built their lives around his teachings, and found in him something that satisfied the deepest hungers of the human spirit, he was whatever the most alive and real thing they ever encountered was. 2,000 years, 3 great traditions, billions of lives shaped by the question. And the question is still not closed. Maybe that is the most honest thing that can be said. The conversation about Jesus is not over. It is not even close to over. It is happening right now, in seminaries and mosques and synagogues and philosophy departments and hospital rooms and prison cells and refugee camps and living rooms at 2 in the morning when someone is trying to figure out what they believe. That conversation started in a Roman province 2,000 years ago with a Jewish preacher who ate with sinners and told his followers not to be afraid. Whatever he was, The conversation he started is still the most consequential one that humanity has ever had.